Are there ways in which your scientific work itself has caused you to think about life's deeper questions? So I guess alternative ways would be that they're completely compartmentalized or something, but are there ways in which that the work itself that you've done has caused you to think about those deeper questions?
Yeah, only in the sense that I think it's very natural for a question like, why did life forms originate in the first place, right? Those kinds of questions, very natural to ask those over the course of a career in the life sciences, right? Well, why are they there anyway, right? And what you find is that, right, as I was mentioning earlier, we don't really have the tools in science to answer a question like that, right? And so it's not as though that then directly leads me to God, but I think what it does is it helps me to understand what science is equipped to do and what it's not equipped to do. And so at that point, I'm sort of free to explore if there are any other avenues to knowledge for answering that question. Maybe there are none, but maybe there is one. And I think for me, the real critical thing is that working in science helps me to embrace that science doesn't constrain me to look only to science. I think that's really the sort of critical thing for me.
Yeah, I think one of the things that science in some ways is very liberating, because there are things you can test and you can test them. And there are things you can know and you can know them. And there are things which, I hate to sort of channel my inner Rumsfeld here, there are things you don't know and you don't know that you don't know them. There are things you know, right? And that's how it is, right? So I hate to be quoting someone that I'm not necessarily always enamored with, but that's a good quote, actually. And so as a scientist, you test what you can test. But for me, what was special was when I began to understand the complexity and the beauty of life and the specialness of life as a biologist, you really begin to think about the big questions. Why am I here? How did I get here? How did this all happen? And so there's a lot of ways in which science leads you to think about these bigger questions, even though you're looking at something very minute in your laboratory. Like, we look at very minute things, but it opens up really different universes for us. And so we think really hard about those things. We don't often have answers to those big questions. And science is ill-prepared in some respects to get at questions that you can't propose an experiment for. So you can't, it's hard to prove some things, not just because of technology, but because it's hard to actually frame an experiment. So we, as scientists, want to be open and thoughtful. And I read, you know, for me, like I said, I read Stoicism a lot. I try to think very hard, very rationally. But I know I'm a human being at the end of the day, and I make the same kinds of mistakes and have the same kinds of challenges that everybody else has. So it doesn't make me immune to those challenges of life. Rabbi, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, I mean, I wonder, you know, since you brought up your affection for Stoic thought, you know, one of the things that I'm reflecting about a little bit is whether, Praveen, maybe you can comment on this, whether you suppose that the goal of a purposeful moral life is in some way to supersede the body. Right? We talked about the identity that we have that comes from having a certain kind of body, right? A certain kind of biology or genetic makeup, and the kinds of self that we develop because of our values and the things that we learn and the way that we want to move through the world. So I wonder if you suppose that the purpose of a spiritual, principled life is to, like I said, supersede the body, to get past our body's limitations, appetites, hungers, desires. Yeah, so I wonder if you could reflect on that a little bit.
That is a great question. I'm not sure I would necessarily frame it in that way. There's a bit of Buddhist philosophy there, which I think is very interesting to talk about, but isn't necessarily the way in which I think about it. And so I'll try to be careful here in the way that I describe, you know, the way that I think about my biological nature and my spiritual nature. Okay, so it is true that I feel as though what makes humans unique, and this is actually, I believe, a conversation point for later, but maybe we'll dive right in, is not so much our biological nature, okay, as it is our spiritual nature. And let me tell you what I mean by that. You know, we've tried for centuries as scientists to make all sorts of claims about biological uniqueness of humans. Maybe it's making tools, maybe it's the ability to form empathy, maybe it's reasoning ability. And the more that we learn, the more that we find that other animals, generally primates, experience or have these kinds of features too. So these quote unquote markers of humanity end up getting a bit fuzzy, right, as to whether they really are clear, cut, and dry markers of humanity. And so I think it is not so much our biological nature at the end of the day that distinguishes us, in my belief, that it is our spiritual nature. There's a God-breathed spirit, and there is a desire to know him, a desire to have fellowship with him, a propensity to ask these kinds of big questions of life. And then as a Christian, I also believe that there is a calling to represent him well, to take care of the world that we're in, and to contribute to the creative processes that he's authored, right? And so it's those things, all of which I sort of wrap up into our spiritual nature, that I think more cleanly delineates us from other animals, as wonderful as they are, but that may not necessarily have those callings, right? So I think those are the things that do ultimately make humans unique, in my view. And so in that way, there is something to me that's special about the spiritual nature that we have been given. But I would not translate that into the body is not good, right? Or that we need to supersede the body, or there's something bad about the body. I think the body is still very good too. And it's actually this integration of the body and the spirit that ultimately makes us unique.
Question specifically for Rabbi Hayon, if that's okay. I kind of picked on them first before, but I'm interested to know from your perhaps perspective in particular, if it's important to know what you believe at all. So why should these folks be thinking about that at all? And if the scientific method, and this is where I think others can jump in as well, can be used to develop or be an assessor of one's belief system, is that the right kind of tool or framework to assess the belief system?
Yeah, I mean, from a Jewish perspective, absolutely. That the Judaism has never been a community of dogma or catechism, right? It's the Jewish faith has always grown and thrived in the study hall more than in the monk's cave, right? That Jewish thought, classical Jewish thought, has always understood that the way to find truth, enlightenment, to fulfill your mission on earth is by learning. And not by sort of swallowing dogma whole, but by asking really hard questions, by challenging your teachers. The greatest triumph that a teacher can have is to raise a student who's smarter than he is, right? Who teaches him something that he didn't know. So I think it's very, very important to connect knowing and doing, probably even above believing. So yeah, I would say for sure. And one more thing, and that the great thinkers of Jewish life, at least from the Middle Ages to today, have been people that came out of the rationalist school of philosophy. They're not, I mean, certainly we have our mystics and we have other folks that come at Jewish belief from other ways, but systematic ethical philosophy has always been very, very important to the development of Judaism as it lives in the world today.
Yeah, thank you. I was curious to ask you that. Do others have reflections, or maybe you do as well, on whether or not the science itself can be used to evaluate belief systems, or it's a large question.
I mean, science, by definition, does not address belief.
Mm-hmm.
Belief is contradictory, philosophically, in my mind, to belief. To believe is a different, entirely different matter. Mm-hmm. And so science, I would not propose to test belief through the scientific method. I can explore the universe. I can test ideas, but belief, by definition, does not require experimental validation. And so therefore, I would posit that it's actually not something I would want to do. I want to have rational thought. Right. I want to have hard questions, but I don't think I can derive like a method to look at belief in that way. That's my own personal view. So I think there's rational questions, hard questions, but it's hard to test.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If I could, just briefly, I really enjoyed those reflections on the question of whether it is important to know what you believe. I would say that it is. I think we all believe something, And I think we all bring some kind of a worldview to the table. Now, that might be intentional and well reflected upon and sort of purposeful, or it might be more passive, something we've just absorbed from the world around us, right, just by existing. And I would contend that the former is healthier for two major reasons. One is that when you have an idea of what you believe, you're more readily available to be challenged about what you believe. And I think a tested belief is important, right? Because it leads to the asking of those kinds of hard questions, which I think is really, really important even in the realm of belief, right? And I do agree that the Jewish tradition really holds that up more than any that I know. I think that it is very, very important to have a tested, challenged belief, because then that's how we grow, right? I think that's how we learn and that's how we grow. I think the second reason is we're all gonna face real hard circumstances and challenges in our lives. When we have some kind of a center or a foundation that will help us to kind of reorient us to what we believe are our priorities in helping us make those hard decisions going forward, knowing what you believe can be very instructive and helpful in those times and very centering. And so can science help us to get there? More or less, I would agree with what Dr. Shamu said, with one caveat that I think with certain kinds of faith, like Christianity, which are deeply rooted in historicity. I mean, there are claims that are being made, right, that should be testable in some fashion or the other, right? Not a classic molecular biology experiment, but there are ways in which to examine literature. There are ways in which to, archaeological digs. There are ways in which to study historical texts, all in an effort to maybe examine the historical claims that Christianity makes. And so there are things like that that maybe are subject indeed, and in fact, I went through many of these myself to try to establish the likelihood of veracity, right, of these claims. But at the end of the day, there is a leap of faith that one is taking that is not really scientific in nature.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. I was going to push you a little bit on that question about what role research and learning and reason has in sort of testing belief. Because I think you're right. I think that there is, I don't know how to ask this question, but certainly for believers, it matters whether Jesus was a historical person who existed in the world. It matters whether there was a Mount Sinai where something happened. It matters whether Muhammad did certain things and actually was able to hear the word of God, right? These things matter, and it's worth, one of the crises of modern faith identity has been that as we develop new and sharper tools of study in archaeology, in manuscript theory, in genetics, all of a sudden that sort of the circle of faith's mystery gets smaller and smaller. So we wonder whether or not faith can survive as reason grows.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point at the end there, and I wonder if I can take just a minute or two to respond to it. Two things actually that I want to say to one of your first comments and then the final comment. I completely agree with you, although I think it is worth noting that that's more true in some faith traditions than others. So for example, in Hinduism, at least in my experience, it's quite rare that someone really cares about whether something happened or not. It's not that critical, right? Mahatma Gandhi famously said that the greatest teacher for him was Jesus, and someone asked him, if we could prove to you that Jesus didn't exist, would that bother you? And he said, absolutely not, I would still love the Sermon on the Mount, right? Whereas for a Christian, let's say that proof were to come, everything falls apart, right? In fact, it even says in the scriptures that the entire faith rests on the veracity of the resurrection, right? And so there are different faith traditions will interact with the need for historical truth a little bit differently. To your latter point, I think that's a really interesting point. So Stephen Jay Gould actually provided a model of thinking about science and faith. And he was well-intentioned in doing this actually because he didn't want fighting, right? He said, let's all just get along, right? And so what he said was, let's have a Venn diagram with two circles that are non-overlapping, right? And so there's one circle over here, and that's science, that's naturalism, that's things that we can mechanistically understand by doing science, right? And then there's stuff over here that's faith, and that's just in a different realm, and it explains things that science can't. The problem with that model, right, is that, as you say, the more that the more scientific advanced we become, right, the more of the phenomena that we see that we're able to explain by purely naturalistic means. And so then that has the impression of pushing faith out, right, to the point where that circle of science or naturalism kind of like just takes over. But for me, the reality is the model is completely different, where God sits above whatever kind of rectangular space we're thinking about here, okay? And there are those spheres of things that can be explained naturalistically or perhaps not, miracles or what have you, okay? But it's all under the purview of God. To me, something that's explained naturalistically, it doesn't take the wonder of it away from me. I just think, wow, it's really cool that God did it that way, right? So it doesn't take it away and say, okay, well, that's not in God's domain. God's domain is only things that defy natural laws. But that's not actually the reality of the way that I think about my faith. His domain is that which is natural and that which isn't. And I have no clue what percentage is what, right? And maybe one day I'll find out, but it really doesn't concern me. And if we keep finding more and more things that are explainable naturalistically, as I said, he still sits atop of that.
I guess, I feel that in my construction of this Venn diagram, I don't need anyone at the top.
Yeah.
I have the natural world, and there are things I don't understand, the great unknown. And as science expands and our knowledge expands, I don't really feel that, I think that's pretty much an infinite unknown. Mm-hmm. So I'm not too worried about us figuring it all out in the next few generations. Yeah. So I think that the challenge is always there, but for me as an agnostic, I don't need that additional construction. Now I understand that that's my own view, right? But for me, I don't have to have that construction, nor does it seem to be necessary. Again, that's my sort of science side coming out. I don't need to have that there to explain the things that I know and don't know. And so for me, it's an interesting contrast as I listen to this. Like this, I think Stephen Jay Gould was well-intentioned, but I also reject that model because I don't think it's very satisfying for either of us sitting around the table, because I think it makes this really artificial construction that I don't think is really helpful.
Yeah, I think there's a really, can I get 1 minute? Because this is so interesting. I think there's a really interesting point that Dr. Shamu's making there. And it's actually a conversation I have with a lot of students. They come to me and ask, so how, at what point did you realize there was a need to invoke God, to explain something? And I actually try to avoid that at all costs, because you really fall into a trap there of something called the God of the gaps, right? Just when you think you need to invoke God for something, and then suddenly there's some sort of material, naturalistic explanation for something. So for me, it has actually never really been about, I really need God to kind of explain all of this for me. It's more that, again, kind of going back to understanding what science is and what it isn't just freed me up to explore what all else was out there, right, in terms of the supernatural realm. And I was completely fine with the idea that I would walk away thinking, none of it's real, or that you just can't know. I was quite open-minded to all of those possibilities. And so for me, it was never actually really about a need. It was that I was really just struck by the person of Jesus. And I think that motivated me to want to learn more, both from the historical standpoint and from the theological standpoint. What was this whole story about, right? And so I wasn't driven to have God in my model out of a need necessarily, right? Even though Ecclesiastes says that God has written eternity into the hearts of men and women, right? But even though it does say that, it wasn't necessarily my primary motivation, the need to kind of see that God is necessary for all of this to make sense to me. It was more that I was struck by who he said he was.